Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts, myths, and the patient untangling of both. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the field of old misunderstandings. A scientist who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of Myths from Long Ago. Myths that were never in a hurry to be proven wrong. There is, in the long, slow sands of ancient Egypt, a belief that crocodiles weep to lure their prey. The image is not entirely false in its surface detail, for crocodiles can sometimes be seen shedding what appear to be tears. But the truth, if we let it drift in, is less dramatic. These tears are a quiet byproduct of a reptile's peculiar tear ducts, moistening eyes that spend much time both in and out of the water. Interestingly, these secretions are also linked to a gland that helps maintain the salt balance in their bodies, especially when near brackish waters or the edge of the Nile. Hunting is not improved by such moisture, and no cunning trap is being laid. The myth may have flowed into being from those who watched and imagined intent, where only biology was at work. Even the most careful observers of Nile crocodiles could see water glistening around their eyes at various times of day, perhaps in early morning or under the sun's glare, and naturally attributed intent to something that was simply nature operating quietly, efficiently, and entirely without malice. This is not exciting. Not even a little bit. And that is just perfect. Let us drift, ever so slowly, toward the lands of ancient Greece, around the quiet century of 500 BCE. Here, a curious thought held sway, that hyenas could change their sex at will. Aristotle himself wrote it, and when such a thinker writes, people tend to believe. Yet, the reality rests in the gentle shadows of anatomy. Female spotted hyenas possess what is called a pseudopenis, a remarkable structure that so closely resembles the male's organ that casual observers, and even careful ones, could be forgiven for confusion. Beyond its visual similarity, this organ is used by female hyenas for urination, mating, and even giving birth, which is an extraordinary fact, considering the complexity and risk involved in delivery. Young hyenas, when emerging into the world, must navigate this structure, and in doing so, demonstrate both resilience and a quietly intricate evolutionary design. And so the tale grew, not from magic, but from the still, intricate designs of nature, an anatomy that was misunderstood, yet perfectly functional, serving social and reproductive roles within hyena clans with quiet efficiency. Let us float further, to another Greek idea of the same era, that bees might be born from the bodies of dead oxen. This belief, called bugonia, felt as natural to them as the morning light. You could leave a slaughtered animal, and in time, buzzing life would emerge. Of course, what was really happening was not birth from the flesh, but the simple arrival of opportunistic insects, whose larvae would develop in the shelter of decay. Honeybees, in particular, were revered in Greek culture, associated with fertility, the divine, and mysterious natural processes. Observing flies and beetles appearing in carcasses may have suggested spontaneous generation. Yet, in reality, this was merely the life cycle of scavenging insects, quietly converting one form of organic matter into another. But it took many quiet centuries for anyone to realize this, as people lacked microscopes or the understanding of germ theory. The entire idea reflects a patient and slow human attempt to interpret the rhythms of life and death without modern scientific tools, which is not particularly thrilling, and that is completely fine. We may now slip a little further in time, to about 400 BCE, and the gentle notion that swallows hibernate beneath the waters during winter. Aristotle again noted it as fact. The truth is less wet, and more wide. For swallows simply migrate. These small birds travel thousands of kilometers to warmer climates, following subtle environmental cues such as changes in daylight and temperature. Ancient minds, not equipped to follow birds across continents, naturally speculated that they must vanish somewhere, perhaps in water or underground. Migration itself is an intricate ballet of endurance, energy storage, and navigational ability, with swallows often traveling at night and resting during the day. But migration was, to many ancient minds, an unimaginable concept. Birds disappearing, only to reappear months later, was easier to explain. By picturing them sleeping beneath a lake's still surface, a vision both calm and quietly mysterious, evoking a world where nature's cycles are slow, hidden, and deeply unhurried. Let us move, without haste, to the last of these tonight. The Rome of about 100 BC, where it was said, "Salamanders are born from fire." They were thought to not only survive flame, but to quench it entirely. In reality, salamanders prefer the cool damp, and if they emerged from burning logs, it was only because they had been hiding within the moist wood, and fled the heat when the logs were placed upon the hearth. These small amphibians require environments with high humidity, often living under logs, stones, and leaf litter. Their skin is delicate and must remain moist for respiration. Observing them flee a fire could have given the impression of magical resilience, especially when combined with the flickering light of flames and the imagination of onlookers. It was never magic, only the quiet survival instincts of a small, damp creature, seeking shelter, moisture, and safety, doing so in a way that humans of that time could only interpret as fantastical. Now, let us drift gently into the time of ancient Rome, around 100 BC, a time when elephants were considered so extraordinary, so impossibly large, that observers believed they could not bend their knees. Yes, in the eyes of those who watched these gentle giants, elephants appeared as if rigid, towering, and forever upright. Yet the truth, if we allow it to settle slowly in our minds, is quite different. Elephants, in fact, have knees just as other mammals do, both forelimbs and hind limbs containing joints capable of flexion. They can kneel, they can lie down, and they do so often, especially when resting or giving birth. Their massive weight, supported by thick, column-like legs, may give the impression of stiffness, particularly when they rise with slow deliberation from a prone position, as if every movement is measured, intentional, and eternal in its patience. Observers, who were unaccustomed to such size and weight, might easily imagine that the elephant's legs were permanently straight, rigid as pillars of marble, never bending, never faltering. Yet these animals, so calm, so deliberate, are entirely capable of the quiet movements we take for granted in smaller creatures. Their ability to kneel allows them to drink water, reach the ground, and even lie fully down to sleep, often on cool soil or soft grass, moving slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A living paradox of immense strength paired with delicate flexibility. This fact is not exciting, and that is exactly why it is perfect for contemplation as we drift further into our evening. Let us now float gently across the Roman world, to the curious notion that barnacle geese grew upon trees. This idea held firmly around 100 CE, arose because observers never saw the geese nesting during European winters. How? They wondered. Could a bird vanish for so long, only to reappear in spring? A plausible, if rather peculiar, explanation was that these geese grew from the barnacles on certain trees or driftwood, slowly emerging as living creatures when the season was right. In reality, barnacle geese are migratory birds, traveling great distances between breeding grounds in the Arctic and wintering grounds in more temperate climates. Their absence was entirely natural, dictated by the slow rhythms of climate, daylight, and instinctive navigation. Yet the human mind, ever curious, filled the gaps with a story. A quiet, imaginative interpretation of natural cycles, one that tied the strange appearance of geese to a visual cue, the barnacle, visible on trees and floating logs. The barnacle, small, pale, and intricate, may have resembled an embryonic stage to the contemplative eye. And so the myth took root. One can almost picture a scholar, leaning close, inspecting driftwood, noting the tiny shells, and murmuring softly to themselves, "Yes, this is the source of the geese," as if nature itself whispered secrets in hushed tones, waiting to be misinterpreted in the gentlest way possible. Now, let us wander slowly eastward, to ancient India, around 200 CE, where snakes were believed, quite naturally, to drink milk. Yes. The idea that serpents would find nourishment in milk persisted for centuries. Particularly within religious rituals, where milk was offered at shrines, sometimes poured over stone carvings of serpents or sacred pits known as Naga wells. Yet, in reality, snakes are lactose intolerant, entirely unsuited to digesting milk or dairy products. Their bodies lack the enzymes needed to process lactose, and such offerings are symbolic rather than nutritional. Still, the myth endures, perhaps because snakes' smooth, glistening scales, and their quiet, sinuous movements, evoke a sense of magic and mystery, making them suitable vessels for symbolic nourishment in religious practice. It is also easy to imagine a slow, serene temple scene, with liquid dripping quietly into stone basins, the hiss of a snake blending imperceptibly with chants in the gentle breeze, creating the illusion that the snake drinks, quietly, patiently, and knowingly, as if it comprehended the intention behind the act. The fact that snakes cannot actually drink milk does not diminish the myth's soft, persistent life in human culture, and this is not alarming, nor is it urgent, but perfectly suited to gentle reflection. Let us drift even further, to ancient China, around 300 CE, where cranes were believed to live for 1,000 years. Such longevity, tied to Taoist symbolism, represented immortality, purity, and harmony with nature. In reality, wild cranes live only decades, usually around 20 to 30 years, depending on species and environmental conditions. Yet the myth floated lightly across texts, scrolls, and whispered teachings, becoming entwined with art, poetry, and philosophical musings on eternal life. Cranes themselves, with their long, graceful necks and slow, deliberate movements, seem to embody patience, reflection, and calm endurance. Watching a crane stand motionless beside a still pond, one might imagine time stretching around it, years unfolding slowly as if carried on soft breezes. This association with longevity, combined with the bird's serene elegance, encouraged the belief in millennial lifespans, a symbol rather than literal truth, yet no less comforting in the imagination. And so, the crane, perched quietly on rocks or marsh edges, becomes not only a living creature but also a soft, enduring emblem of time passing slowly, gently, in ways that invite contemplation and the most relaxed of sighs. Now, let us drift gently into the forests and rivers of medieval Europe, around 1100 CE, where a particularly strange story arose about beavers. Observers believed, with quiet conviction, that these furry, industrious creatures, when hunted, would bite off their own testicles to escape the predator. The mental image is dramatic, yet the truth, if we let it settle slowly into our minds, is far less alarming. What was actually being observed was the use of scent glands, known as castoreum, located near the tail and abdomen. Hunters, noting the pungent aroma and the occasional shedding of these glands, misinterpreted the biology entirely. Beavers do not self-mutilate, but they do secrete castoreum, a complex substance that is used for marking territory, communicating with other beavers, and perhaps deterring predators through its strong odor. The misreading of this natural phenomenon led to a myth so persistent that it drifted through medieval texts, manuscripts, and oral storytelling, coloring human imagination with cautionary tales about animal cleverness and self-sacrifice. If we pause and imagine the slow, methodical gnawing of a beaver at a tree, the gentle splash of water nearby, we can see how subtle observations could be misread, interpreted through fear, wonder, or simple lack of anatomical understanding. This fact is quiet, mundane, and perfectly suited for reflection as we let our thoughts meander like rivers over time. Let us float forward to the 1200 CE, where bestiaries, those collections of wondrous, curious animals, tell us that lions sleep with their eyes open. Yes, in the illuminated pages of medieval manuscripts, lions were often depicted with unblinking, almost mystical gazes, lying in repose as if perpetually alert. Yet, the reality is far softer, far more ordinary. Lions, like most mammals, close their eyes when sleeping. The bestiary writers, perhaps inspired by the occasional half-open stare of a resting lion, or by symbolic interpretations of vigilance, courage, and watchfulness, recorded this behavior as fact. It is not malicious, nor deceptive, merely human imagination imposing structure upon nature's gentle patterns. Lions sleep for many hours each day, in quiet, shaded places, their powerful bodies relaxed, their breathing slow and rhythmic, muscles loosening under the weight of tranquility. To imagine a lion lying awake indefinitely, eyes open, observing the world, is to overlay human symbolism onto the soft, undemanding reality of a resting creature. And so the myth persists, quietly, like a shadow moving across a sun-dappled meadow. Let us wander to the 1200s once more, to consider the story of pelicans feeding their chicks with their own blood. This belief, carried through medieval texts and art, is dramatic, perhaps even a little alarming. Yet the truth is much gentler. Pelicans feed their young by regurgitating pre-digested fish into the mouths of their chicks, sometimes using their beaks to nudge the little ones' heads or preen them carefully. Observers, noting the red-tinted interior of the mouth, the ritualized preening and feeding, or the occasional scratches and abrasions from beaks, interpreted this as the bird offering its own blood. Christian artists and writers embraced this symbolism, portraying pelicans as self-sacrificing, nurturing figures, emblematic of care, charity, and Christ's own self-giving. In nature, no blood is involved, only the patient transfer of nourishment from parent to offspring. The myth, however, lingers, floating through centuries of imagination, a quiet testament to human tendency to overlay drama upon the soft, ordinary processes of life. We can picture, if we wish, a pelican standing beside calm waters, dipping its head slowly, preening its young, utterly patient, utterly unremarkable in its devotion. About 1250 CE, where stonemasons whispered tales of toads living inside stones for centuries. The claim, as strange as it sounds, comes from reports of solid rock being split, revealing a small, living creature within. Biology, however, is far less accommodating. Toads cannot survive encased in stone, they require oxygen, moisture, and food, all of which are absent inside solid rock. The stonemason's discovery most likely involved toads seeking shelter in crevices or under loose stones, later interpreted, over time, as eternal entrapment. It is easy to imagine a mason, hammer in hand, striking open a rock with a slow, deliberate rhythm, and finding a hidden, moist little toad, alive and blinking, prompting awe and storytelling that exaggerated into centuries-long survival. This myth, though entirely impossible biologically, is comforting in its quiet wonder, a testament to human fascination with hidden life, the slow persistence of small creatures, and the soft, patient weaving of story from observation. Drifting softly into the forests and villages of medieval Europe, around 1300 CE, where owls, with their wide, solemn eyes, were often believed to be harbingers of death. People heard the hooting of these nocturnal birds and, noticing that night followed day, and that sometimes illness or misfortune coincided with the sound, concluded that the owl's call foretold mortality. Yet, the reality is far quieter, far less alarming. Owls are merely birds of the night, adapted to hunt small mammals in darkness, using their acute hearing and silent flight. Their calls, whether hoots, screeches, or whistles, are communication, marking territory or signaling mates. The link to death is entirely human imagination, flowing from superstition, coincidence, and the slow, patient weaving of narrative to explain what is not understood. Imagine if we allow ourselves to drift. A great horned owl perched silently in the moonlight, wings tucked, eyes reflective and steady, speaking not of misfortune, but only of survival, rhythm, and calm nocturnal observation. This fact is not ominous, and that is perfectly fine for our gentle wandering minds. Ever so slowly we move on to another curious belief of the same century, that bats were not mammals, but birds. Yes, people observed the small, winged creatures flitting at twilight and assumed, naturally, that flight equated to bird nests. Only later, during the Renaissance, did anatomists clarify that bats are mammals, not birds, possessing fur, mammary glands, and warm-blooded physiology, despite their nocturnal habits and membranous wings. Before that understanding, the bat existed in the human imagination as a shadowy, liminal being, part bird, part mystery, flitting between reality and story. Watching them swoop silently over village ponds or moonlit fields, people could see wings beating, and conclude, with calm confidence, that these were avian creatures of twilight. In truth, they were small, quiet mammals, living complex social lives in roosts, and feeding on insects in a perfectly natural, unremarkable way. The misclassification, like many myths, lingers as a gentle reminder that observation without anatomy can lead to quiet misunderstanding, entirely harmless, entirely mundane. About 1400 CE, and the idea that wolves possess paralyzing stares. Folklore whispered that a wolf locking eyes with a human could freeze limbs, rendering the observer helpless. The reality, of course, is far more ordinary. Wolves are large, attentive predators, using vision, hearing, and smell to hunt and communicate. But no amount of eye contact can paralyze. The legend may have arisen from a mixture of fear, respect, and encounters with wild wolves that caused humans to pause, to stand still, as they assessed the animal's intent. Eye contact in the wild is often a tense, frozen moment, and human imagination, patient and precise, converted this natural caution into mythic paralysis. Wolves themselves retreat, approach, or hunt according to instinct, never invoking magical stasis. One can picture, softly, a lone wolf under a snowy forest canopy, gaze steady but natural, shadows playing over its fur, entirely indifferent to the stories humans whisper behind closed doors. The myth, quiet, persistent, flows gently through time. Without hurry we move on to the curious tale, also around 1400 CE, that crabs, in buckets or containers, drag each other down. Observers noted that when crabs were confined together, some seemed unable to escape, while others moved atop them, giving the impression of mutual sabotage. This, however, is not a natural crab behavior, but rather a projection of human assumptions onto animal interactions. Crabs, in crowded conditions, may climb over each other simply to move toward water or food, or as a consequence of confined space. Humans, noticing this, interpreted it as deliberate interference, cruelty or malice, which mirrors social anxieties more than crustacean behavior. Imagine, if we drift, the gentle movement of crabs along a damp shore, shells glistening in muted light, each navigating quietly, independently, entirely indifferent to the other's fate, guided only by instinct, water, and the slow rhythm of tidal life. The myth arises from human interpretation, not from the creatures themselves, a soft reminder that projection can create stories that are not grounded in observable reality. Drifting gently toward the mid-15th century, around 1450 CE, where the porcupine was believed to possess a most remarkable and dramatic ability to shoot its quills like tiny spears at would-be attackers. Observers imagined the creature trembling with danger, releasing its sharp armor with force and precision. In truth, if we let our minds settle quietly, porcupines cannot launch quills. The quills themselves are modified hairs with microscopic barbs, designed to detach and embed in anything that makes contact. When a predator bites or brushes against a porcupine, the quills come loose, painfully. But they do so passively, not actively. The myth likely arose from witnessing the surprising effectiveness of these quills when they did embed, combined with imagination, and perhaps a slight exaggeration in storytelling. If we picture a porcupine slowly waddling through underbrush, tail quivering, quills shimmering in muted light, the gentle detachment of these structures appears far less magical, yet quietly effective in self-defense. Nature's design is precise, intentional, and thoroughly mundane, perfectly suited to contemplation as we drift, slowly, ever so slowly, into the dawn of Renaissance Europe, around 1500 CE, where goats were said to be able to eat and digest anything. Such an assertion, though amusing, is not strictly accurate. Goats are curious browsers, nibbling on a wide range of vegetation, occasionally sampling items humans might not consider food, like bark, paper, or fabrics. However, their digestive systems are specialized ruminants, capable of breaking down cellulose from plants, but they cannot safely digest non-food items. Indigestible or toxic substances can cause harm, and yet, observing a goat nibble and chew seemingly anything inspired stories of boundless appetite. If we imagine slowly, carefully, a goat wandering among garden edges, tasting leaves, bending its head toward the soft earth, the myth seems understandable, arising from observation of curious behavior, amplified by imagination and a touch of human humor. Curiosity, patience, and slow chewing are the real powers here, rather than any magical omnivorous capacity. In the mid-16th century, around 1550 CE, to consider dolphins, long misclassified as fish. Early naturalists, observing their streamlined bodies and aquatic grace, assumed them to be members of the piscine world. Yet, dolphins are mammals, with lungs, warm-blooded physiology, and the tender practice of nursing their young. They breathe air at the surface, form social pods, and display remarkable intelligence in communication, all traits that distinguish them from fish. The myth that they are fish likely persisted because their fins and aquatic habits superficially resemble piscine traits. If we let ourselves float gently alongside the imagined sea, we can see dolphins moving through calm waves, exhaling air, surfacing slowly, nurturing their calves. Perfectly ordinary in the mammalian sense, yet entirely magical to those who did not understand anatomy. Observation, combined with lack of precise classification, gave birth to enduring confusion, quietly settled only by patient anatomical study. Around 1600 CE, where salamanders were believed to be cold to the touch and immune to fire. The myth persists in old texts, reflecting medieval fascination with paradox and contradiction. In reality, salamanders are sensitive amphibians, requiring moist, cool environments, and their skin is delicate, easily harmed by heat or dryness. They cannot survive fire, nor do they possess mystical thermal properties. The legend likely arose from observing salamanders emerge from logs placed near embers, escaping the heat, and from their pale, sometimes damp appearance, which may have suggested coldness or otherworldly resilience. If we imagine slowly a salamander sliding quietly from mossy stones, avoiding sun and flame alike, its body cool and moist, we see a creature entirely ordinary in its biology, yet inspiring stories that last centuries. The myth is soft, harmless, and quietly illustrates human fascination with the improbable, gently coloring natural observation with the brush of imagination. Moving on to Renaissance Europe, around 1600 CE, where the ocean's most formidable hunters, sharks, were believed to die if they ever stopped swimming. Early naturalists, watching these creatures glide relentlessly through sunlit shallows or deeper currents, assumed perpetual motion was a matter of life or death. Yet, the reality, if we let it settle quietly in our minds, is a little more nuanced. Some shark species do need to swim continuously to force water over their gills for oxygen, a process called ram ventilation. Other species, however, can rest on the sea floor, gently pumping water over their gills using specialized muscles, and survive in a state of calm, slow repose. The myth arises from observation of the more active species, combined with imagination, and perhaps a sense of awe at their sleek, eternal motion. Picture, softly, a shark gliding beneath dappled waves, fins cutting slowly through water, moving, resting, breathing. A rhythm entirely natural, entirely ordinary, yet rendered dramatic by human interpretation. This fact is precise, factual, and yet entirely gentle, perfectly suited for quiet reflection. A little further down, around 1650 CE, to the forests and dens of Europe, where bears were believed to give birth to shapeless lumps of flesh. Such stories, dramatic and vivid, likely arose from observations of very young cubs, born tiny, blind, and helpless, perhaps appearing as formless masses to an inattentive eye. In reality, bear cubs are small but fully formed, with limbs, claws, and soft fur developing quickly, entirely suited to life in the maternal den. The myth gently persists because the first glimpse of a newborn cub, a tiny, quiet being hidden in a dark den, could be startling, leading observers to imagine incomprehensible beginnings. If we picture, slowly, a mother bear nestled in mossy, dim surroundings, her cubs curling against her, breathing, moving, quietly learning the rhythm of life, we can understand how imagination added layers of myth to reality. Observation, patience, and gentle misinterpretation created a story, soft and vivid, yet entirely unnecessary, as the biology itself is quietly remarkable. In the 18th century, to the vast plains and deserts of Africa, where ostriches were believed to bury their heads in the sand, travelers imagined these enormous birds lowering themselves, face pressed into the earth, hiding from danger, or covering their eyes in quiet despair. In reality, Ostriches bend low to the ground to feed on seeds and vegetation, or to turn their eggs carefully in shallow nests, never burying their heads. The myth, perhaps inspired by the visual effect of an ostrich lowering its head, neck extended, feathers brushing soil, gives a striking, almost theatrical impression of disappearance. Picture, softly, an ostrich moving slowly, careful and deliberate, neck undulating gently, beak grazing the earth. Entirely aware, entirely calm. A creature shaped by evolution to survive open landscapes. Misunderstood by the human imagination, which loves a quietly dramatic story, even when unnecessary. And now to the open oceans of the 18th century, where whales were commonly believed to be fish. Whalers and explorers, observing the enormous bodies moving through water, breathless only at intervals, concluded, gently, that these magnificent creatures belonged to the Piscine world. In truth, whales are mammals, breathing air through blowholes, warm-blooded, nursing their young, and forming complex social structures. The confusion persisted because outwardly, whales share many traits with fish: fins, streamlined bodies, aquatic grace. Yet beneath the surface, literally and metaphorically, they are mammals in every sense, adapted to marine life with lungs, thick blubber, and slow, deliberate communication. Imagine softly a whale surfacing, exhaling misty breath into calm sea air, tail lifting gently before a quiet dive. A rhythm both ordinary and extraordinary, perfectly natural, yet misread by centuries of human observation. The myth, like the waves, rolls gently through history. Soft, persistent, entirely harmless, and quietly fascinating when examined without rush. Moving gently into the quiet corners of the 18th century, where dogs were believed to sweat through their tongues. People observed the panting of these loyal companions, their tongues lolling in heat, and concluded, softly, that the moisture of the tongue was a form of sweat. Yet, in reality, dogs primarily cool themselves through panting, evaporating moisture from the tongue and respiratory tract, rather than through traditional sweat glands. Dogs do have sweat glands, but these are located mostly on their paw pads, and contribute very little to overall thermoregulation. If we picture, slowly, a dog lying in soft sunlight, chest rising and falling, tongue dangling, air flowing gently over moist surfaces, we see a quiet, biological system at work, entirely ordinary, entirely effective, yet misunderstood by human imagination. The myth, subtle, persistent, arises from observation, imagination, and the human tendency to assign simple explanations to complex processes. Another 18th century concern, that cats could steal a baby's breath. This belief, carried in whispers, cautionary tales, and bedside warnings, perhaps arose from cats seeking warmth, curling near infants in soft blankets or cradles. In reality, cats do not have the ability to suffocate babies or steal breath. They are simply drawn to warmth, comfort, and the quiet company of small, still bodies. Imagine slowly a cat padding softly across a dim nursery, whiskers twitching, fur brushing gentle linens, curling beside a sleeping infant, breathing synchronized only in coincidence, perfectly content, entirely harmless. The myth, though persistent, illustrates the human inclination to interpret ordinary behaviors through a lens of caution and story, quietly weaving narrative around natural, benign curiosity. Now, let us drift further, to the belief that cows lie down to predict rain. Farmers, watching herds moving slowly across fields, resting at quiet intervals, concluded that cow behavior was linked to meteorological events. Yet, the truth is far more mundane. Cows lie down for rest, rumination, or simply comfort. Lying down allows their digestion to proceed slowly, muscles to relax, and energy to be conserved. The connection to weather. Entirely coincidental. If we picture, softly, a field of cows, slowly lowering themselves onto soft grass, chewing rhythmically, eyes half closed. The occasional shift of position. We see the calm, deliberate rhythm of bovine life. Perfectly ordinary, entirely unrelated to clouds gathering overhead. The myth. Gentle, patient, persists as a quaint interpretation. A human narrative gently imposed upon everyday behavior. Moving on to the belief that horses sleep standing up exclusively. Observers noted the impressive ability of horses to remain upright while dozing, and concluded that this was the only way they rested. In truth, horses can sleep both standing and lying down. The stay apparatus in their legs allows light, shallow rest while standing, reducing vulnerability to predators, but deep, restorative REM sleep requires lying down. If we imagine slowly, a horse in a meadow, standing quietly in twilight, muscles relaxed but body upright, then gently lowering itself later to lie fully on soft earth, eyes half closed, breathing slow and rhythmic. We see a pattern of rest that is sophisticated, subtle, and entirely natural. The myth, persistent, harmless, arises from partial observation, and the quiet wonder of watching such magnificent creatures at rest. In the 19th century, where chameleons were believed to match any color perfectly to their surroundings, observers imagined these small reptiles as magical artists, blending seamlessly with leaves, bark, and stones. Yet, the reality, if we let it settle quietly, is far more ordinary, and quietly fascinating in its own right. Chameleons change color primarily for communication, temperature regulation, and mood. Hormones, light, and environmental cues influence the pigments in their skin, producing a slow, deliberate shift in hue. They do not instantly become invisible, nor do they perfectly mimic every backdrop. Imagine softly, a chameleon climbing a branch, muscles relaxed, eyes moving independently, slowly adjusting skin tones and subtle gradients. A gentle rhythm of biological adaptation. Entirely natural, entirely serene. Misunderstood by human imagination. The myth, persistent, harmless, flows through human storytelling. A testament to our desire to find magic in ordinary, slow processes of life. The idea, also of the 19th century, that penguins mate for life. Travelers and naturalists watched these tuxedoed birds standing together, sometimes for extended periods, and concluded, gently, that lifelong partnerships were universal. Yet, while some species do maintain long-term bonds, many penguin species switch partners seasonally, responding to environmental pressures, food availability, and nesting success. Imagine slowly, a rocky shoreline, black and white birds waddling and slipping on stones, exchanging calls, forming temporary pairs, nesting, incubating eggs. All in quiet, natural rhythms. The myth, charming as it is, arises from the human inclination to project romantic permanence onto animal behavior, a soft story layered over perfectly ordinary patterns of survival and reproduction. Now, let us drift further, to another 19th century notion, that goldfish have only a 3-second memory. Observers noted the small, gentle creatures swimming in circles and bowls, occasionally repeating actions, and concluded that memory must be fleeting. Yet, research shows that goldfish possess memory spans of months, capable of learning, recognition, and even classical conditioning. If we imagine softly, a goldfish gliding through still water, gills fluttering, eyes slowly scanning, responding to cues, recalling experiences, the quiet competence of this tiny creature becomes apparent. The myth, like ripples in a pond, slowly fades when met with careful observation, revealing subtle, patient intelligence beneath the gentle, seemingly repetitive surface. One of the most persistent myths of the 19th century, that lemmings commit mass suicide. Popularized by staged footage in early documentaries, this dramatic story spread widely, inspiring cautionary tales and human fascination with tragedy in nature. In truth, lemmings migrate in response to population pressures, food scarcity, and environmental cues. Some may accidentally fall from cliffs or into water during dispersal, but there is no intentional self-destruction. Imagine softly. Tundra rolling gently beneath muted skies, small rodents moving steadily, navigating rocks and streams, guided by instinct, survival, and environmental rhythm. Entirely alive, entirely natural. Entirely misunderstood by dramatic storytelling. The myth, persistent, harmless, flows quietly through imagination. Yet the reality, slow and ordinary, holds its own quiet wonder. In the 19th century, where toads were believed to cause warts, people observed the bumpy skin of these quiet amphibians and, gently, assumed that touch could transfer small growths to human hands. Yet, the reality, if we allow ourselves to settle, is far less alarming. Warts are caused by human papillomaviruses, tiny, invisible agents that spread through direct skin contact, not from amphibians. Toads, with their slightly rough, glandular skin, are entirely harmless in this regard. Imagine slowly. A toad sitting quietly on a mossy rock, limbs tucked, eyes blinking slowly. Breathing. Entirely indifferent to human concerns. A creature shaped by evolution for survival, not superstition. Perhaps it waits patiently for a passing insect, tongue flicking lazily, enjoying the damp quiet of the soil and the occasional shadow of a drifting leaf. The myth, soft, persistent, reflects human pattern seeking, connecting unrelated bumps and textures to imagined consequences, entirely unnecessary for the quiet rhythm of life. Another observation, well, let's call it that for now, where bulls were said to hate the color red. Spectators watching bullfighting and field behavior imagined that the scarlet cape provoked rage. In reality, bulls, like other cattle, are colorblind to red. Their reactions arise from motion, size, and proximity rather than hue. Imagine softly. A bull standing in a sunlit pasture, nostrils flaring, ears flicking, responding to movement, wind, and the quiet rhythm of the herd, entirely unaware of the color of any nearby object. Perhaps it shifts weight from hoof to hoof, tail brushing the grass, chewing slowly, attentive to the subtle signals of other herd members, calm yet vigilant. The myth, arising from dramatic spectacle, persists because humans notice only the effects they expect, quietly projecting meaning onto ordinary animal perception, crafting a story from ordinary biology. Moving on to the idea that foxes use cunning to fake death. Folklore tells of sly animals pretending to be still or lifeless to escape predators. In reality, dramatic reports often misinterpret natural stillness, injury, or cautious concealment. Imagine softly. A fox in a dappled forest, body pressed to the leaf litter, breathing slow, ears twitching. Motionless in quiet observation. Entirely alive, entirely ordinary. Perhaps the sun filters gently through branches above, dappling the forest floor, and the fox's fur blends with dry leaves, waiting only for the quiet moment to move on. Humans, watching from a distance, might imagine theatrics, crafting tales of cunning that surpass reality, entirely harmless, entirely persistent in our stories, whispered softly across centuries. Now, let us float to the desert landscapes of human imagination, where camels were believed to store water in their humps. Observers marveled at these creatures' endurance, imagining reservoirs of liquid stored above the back. In truth, humps store fat, which can be metabolized to provide energy and some water, but the animal's hydration depends on tissues and careful physiological balance. Picture, softly, a camel moving slowly across sand, head swaying, hump swaying gently. Every breath measured, metabolism tuned. Quietly surviving extremes, entirely natural, entirely ordinary. Yet inspiring myths of liquid reservoirs hidden beneath fur. Perhaps its eyelids lower slightly, protecting eyes from drifting grains, while slow, deliberate steps leave soft impressions in golden sand, a rhythm in harmony with wind and sun. Ordinary, but quietly mesmerizing. The belief that frogs die if touched by human hands. Their delicate skin, essential for respiration and moisture absorption, is sensitive to oils and chemicals. Yet, gentle contact does not instantly kill. Imagine softly. A frog resting in a damp, shadowed pool, tiny limbs tucked, breathing slow. A creature delicate, resilient, entirely ordinary. While human hands, if careful, pose little threat. Perhaps droplets of water shimmer on its smooth back, reflecting soft, filtered sunlight, or a faint ripple spreads across the quiet pool as it moves slightly. The myth, quiet, cautionary, illustrates a human tendency to dramatize vulnerability, quietly coloring reality with imagined fragility, reminding us that sensitivity does not equate to immediate danger. The myth that alligators can run as fast as horses. Observers, imagining sudden bursts across banks or shallow waters, attributed remarkable speed to these large reptiles. In reality, alligators can briefly reach speeds of roughly 11 miles per hour on land. Far slower than horses, who gallop steadily at double or triple that pace. Picture, softly, an alligator moving deliberately through marshland, tail swaying, eyes scanning. Bursts of motion brief, purposeful. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural. Perhaps water droplets scatter from its tail as it shifts, subtle vibrations traveling across mud, or the reeds bend softly in its passage. The myth, gentle exaggeration, arises from human fascination with danger and spectacle. Quietly persistent, entirely harmless. Perfect for slow reflection, inviting us to observe rather than imagine. In the soft unfolding of the early 20th century, there arose a quietly persistent idea that elephants are afraid of mice. One can imagine slowly a vast savanna, golden grasses swaying in an almost imperceptible breeze, elephants moving in long, ponderous lines, their enormous feet pressing gently into warm, sunlit soil. And nearby, a tiny, swift creature scurrying past, whiskers twitching, shadow flickering across the ground. Observers, watching from a careful distance, might have interpreted the elephant's pause, the slight flick of its ear, or the slow lift of a massive foot, as alarm or terror. In truth, elephants have no innate fear of mice. The sudden motion of a small, unpredictable creature may startle them briefly, as it might startle any being attuned to movement, but there is no biological predisposition to panic at rodents. The myth, drifting softly through human imagination, perhaps finds its origin in the contrast of enormous, lumbering strength and tiny, darting agility, a poetic juxtaposition that invites stories. Picture, gently, the elephant turning its vast, thoughtful eye toward the small movement, sniffing air scented faintly with earth and grass, then returning to slow grazing, entirely calm, entirely ordinary, perfectly adapted to a complex environment. The myth lingers, not because it is true, but because it is an amusing reflection of human narrative, quietly imposed upon a creature that has no concern for invented fears. A narrative of caution, whimsy, and gentle exaggeration, resting lightly in the mind like a feather drifting to mossy ground. In the soft glow of early 20th century natural history, a gentle misconception took root. That koalas are bears. Imagine slowly. A eucalyptus forest, mist curling softly among tall, slender trunks, pale green leaves trembling in a quiet breeze, and nestled among branches, a small, round creature, gray and unhurried, eyes blinking slowly, limbs curled into the gentle curve of a branch. Its nose is broad and leathery, its claws clinging with calm precision. And yet, for centuries, people have whispered the name koala bear, misled by its cuddly appearance and rounded form. In reality, koalas are marsupials, distant relatives of wombats, carrying young in a soft pouch for months after birth. They feed exclusively on eucalyptus leaves, metabolizing the bitter toxins slowly, extracting water and nutrients in a delicate, specialized process that allows them to drift through long, lethargic hours with minimal exertion. Imagine gently their slow, deliberate chewing, the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the faint scent of resin in the air. A creature entirely ordinary in its adaptations, entirely extraordinary in quiet patience. The myth, a simple label applied without observation, drifts softly through classrooms, illustrations, and bedtime stories, inviting the imagination to soften and exaggerate, linking shape to a human notion of bear rather than slow, precise biological reality. Observing closely, one might appreciate softly the specialized anatomy, the slow metabolism, the quiet stillness that allows survival in a sunlit forest, entirely unaware of misapplied names or imagined bear-like fear. In the early decades of the 20th century, there existed a quietly persistent claim that dogs see only in black and white. Imagine slowly a sun-dappled meadow, light filtering through trees and soft lattices, a dog pausing, nose twitching, ears alert, tail swaying gently, eyes scanning the patchwork of grass and shadow. People long assumed that canines perceive the world as monochromatic, perhaps dim shadows and stark outlines, failing to notice subtle hues. Yet the truth, if we drift carefully into it, is more nuanced, more softly colorful. Dogs perceive shades of blue and yellow, their vision tuned for movement and contrast rather than the broad spectrum humans enjoy. Imagine softly a blue flower swaying gently in the breeze, the gentle golden hue of late afternoon sunlight across soft fur. All observed, interpreted, and navigated with skill by a creature that does not need a full rainbow to orient itself and act. Their world, muted perhaps, but rich in pattern, texture, and motion, allows hunting, playing, and companionship to unfold with precision. The myth, gentle, persistent, a simplification of visual complexity, drift through human storytelling, labeling a creature's perception without grasping the quiet sophistication of its adaptations. Watching closely, one might see softly intelligence and sensory acuity, a quiet elegance that compensates entirely for what human eyes cannot detect. Around the same era, another gently floating idea claimed that all bats are blind. Picture, softly, a twilight sky unfolding over a forest, shadows deepening, leaves trembling on slender branches, and a bat skimming through the air, wings thin membranes stretched delicately between elongated fingers. People imagined the night skies dotted with creatures navigating only by sound, tiny echoing whispers creating invisible maps, and assumed blindness as a necessity for survival. Yet, bats have vision, often perfectly suited to low light conditions, and supplemented with echolocation, the faint pulses of sound painting auditory landscapes across the night. Imagine softly the bat's wings slicing through air, navigating deftly around branches, insects, and subtle textures of leaves and twigs. Eyes sensitive to dim patterns, reflecting the soft twilight. A perfectly ordinary, carefully adapted sensory world. The myth, a quiet exaggeration, arises from the poetic interplay of echolocation and night, human fascination with darkness and mystery, softly imposed onto creatures that see, navigate, and act with calm precision. It drifts gently through folklore, inviting curiosity, misinterpretation, and a slow appreciation of nuanced sensory abilities. During this gentle stretch of the early 20th century, people whispered, quietly, that ants never sleep. Imagine softly a sun-warmed patch of soil, small creatures scuttling with delicate purpose, antennae twitching, navigating tiny hills of dirt, foraging in precise lines, bodies moving rhythmically, endlessly. Observers noted the constant motion and assumed endless wakefulness. Yet, ants take micro-naps, brief periods of inactivity throughout the day, often synchronized across the colony in ways that maintain overall productivity while allowing individual rest. Picture, softly, an ant pausing, antennae lowering slightly, legs stilling for moments that may pass unnoticed, then resuming with delicate precision. Their world, small, coordinated, patient, relies on tiny cycles of rest that sustain life over months or years. The myth, drifting through human assumptions, exaggerates continuous motion, ignoring the hidden subtleties of rest, the quiet patterns that sustain a colony, entirely ordinary, entirely remarkable, perfectly suitable for slow reflection and gentle observation of the rhythms of life. In the slow, humid reaches of early 20th century imagination, there arose a quietly persistent tale that piranhas could strip prey to the bone in mere seconds. Picture, softly, the dappled light of a gently flowing river, water moving over stones, currents folding lazily around submerged branches. A shoal of piranhas glides beneath, scales catching the flickering light, small mouths opening and closing in rhythm, but entirely selective in appetite. Observers, imagining the drama of feeding frenzies, assumed that any animal entering the water would be swiftly reduced to bare bones. Yet, the reality, if we drift carefully into it, is far less frantic. Piranhas feed primarily on insects, plant matter, and occasionally carrion. Attacks on large mammals are rare and usually only occur when food is scarce. Imagine gently a large fish brushing past, the piranhas momentarily curious, nibbling here and there, before dispersing, returning to calm, quiet swimming. Entirely ordinary, entirely cautious. The myth, persistent, dramatic, and almost cinematic, flows softly through human storytelling, emphasizing frenzy over the slow, cautious precision that governs most river life. It whispers through the imagination, highlighting danger that exists mostly in observation and narrative rather than in daily reality. Around the same era, there was the idea, floating lightly in public awareness, that crows could remember human faces for centuries. Picture, softly, a quiet park in autumn, amber leaves drifting to the ground, the occasional black silhouette gliding silently across the sky. Crows are intelligent, observant, and capable of recognizing faces, linking past experiences with behavior. They may hold grudges or react cautiously toward individuals they have encountered before, sometimes for years, but not for centuries. Imagine gently a crow alighting on a branch, head tilted, eye glinting with recognition, wings stretching slowly, recalling a distant interaction in remarkable detail, yet limited by lifespan and memory capacity. The myth, drifting through exaggeration, softens time and inflates longevity to poetic extremes, emphasizing the impressive intelligence of a bird while overshooting biological possibility. Observation, imagination, and admiration mingle to create the quiet story. There was also a quietly widespread notion that snakes are slimy. Imagine softly a shaded forest floor, littered with leaves and broken twigs, a snake sliding silently across damp soil, body curved in delicate S-shaped arcs. Its scales, dry and smooth, glisten faintly with moisture from dew or rain, reflecting soft light. The human imagination, projecting slimy textures, exaggerates tactile expectation, mistaking the sheen of living scales for a lubricated surface. In truth, snakes are dry, sleek, and entirely adapted for smooth movement and sensory perception. Imagine gently its tongue flicking slowly, tasting the air, exploring its surroundings, a quiet navigator of leaf litter and soil. Entirely ordinary, entirely meticulous in biological function. The myth, drifting like a leaf on water, lingers because of a poetic misperception rather than observation. In early 20th century lore, hippos were said to sweat blood. Picture. Softly. A sunlit riverbank, ripples catching light, a massive gray body submerged up to the eyes, nostrils flaring gently. When hippos exude a reddish secretion, it is not blood, but a mixture of pigments and fatty acids that protect skin from ultraviolet light and infection. Imagine the warm sun glinting off the liquid as it spreads across thick skin, a slow, natural sunscreen, entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive. The myth, redolent of drama and danger, arises from visual impression, the poetic allure of color, and human fascination with extremes. It flows softly, embellishing the natural, slow physiology of a perfectly adapted river mammal. A quietly dramatic tale drifted into mid-20th century urban legend. That seagulls would explode if fed Alka-Seltzer. Picture. Softly. A coastal pier, gulls wheeling and floating above quietly lapping waves, soft feathers catching stray light. No scientific observation has ever confirmed such an event. The myth arose, likely from playful exaggeration or misapplied curiosity, transforming ordinary birds and effervescent tablets into a dramatic cautionary tale. Imagine the gulls landing gracefully on wooden posts, pecking gently at scraps, entirely unaware of the rumors swirling around them. The story, persistent and amusing, floats like a feather through memory, a quiet exaggeration that sparks imagination without requiring reality to bend. It reminds us, softly, of the human tendency to conflate coincidence, play, and humor into seemingly factual observation, gently embellishing a mundane coastal scene with imagined peril. In the quiet corners of mid-20th century observation, there drifted a gentle, persistent belief that touching a baby bird would cause its parents to reject it. Imagine softly. A moss-dappled forest floor, sunlight filtering through high leaves, a nest cradled carefully in the crook of a branch. A tiny chick peeks upward, soft down glinting faintly in the light, beak opening with a quiet demand for food. Observers, noting the delicacy of the nestling, assumed that human touch would overwhelm the parent's senses, causing abandonment. Yet, the reality, if we pause to consider, is less dramatic, more ordinary. Most birds rely primarily on vision and sound, rather than scent, to recognize their young. Parents respond to chirps, movement, and the faint flutter of wings. Picture. Softly. The adult bird returning from a gentle foraging trip, wings beating with measured rhythm, eyeing the nest carefully, offering food to a chick recently touched by human hands. Entirely ordinary, entirely attentive, entirely calm. The myth, floating through classrooms, advice columns, and whispers among caretakers, exaggerates human projection of smell and guilt onto the bird world. A delicate chick, handled with care, is rarely abandoned. The quiet reality of parental attention, persistence, and instinct sustains life in ways more measured and ordinary than the story implies. The myth lingers, softly, as a cautionary tale, reminding us of care, but embellishing biology with gentle, imagined drama. There existed another quietly circulating story. That armadillos are bulletproof. Imagine gently. A slow, shaded woodland, leaf litter pressed beneath tiny armored feet, the armor plates glinting faintly in filtered sunlight. Observers, imagining invulnerability, extrapolated from the small, overlapping shell of an armadillo that bullets could bounce harmlessly away. In reality, the keratin and bony plates that form its protective carapace provide modest protection. Enough, occasionally, to deflect low-caliber bullets. But not reliably, certainly not against modern firearms. Imagine softly. The armadillo curling into a quiet ball, limbs tucked, eyes barely visible, tail coiled. A creature adapted for slow, methodical defense rather than miraculous invincibility. The myth, drifting through folk tales, cartoons, and casual anecdotes, exaggerates armor into invulnerability. Observers fascinated by the contrast of delicate biology and hard plating imposed dramatic qualities on the quiet animal. It moves slowly, with patient intent, burrowing beneath leaves and soil, entirely ordinary, entirely resilient. But not magically impervious. The tale lingers because it delights in possibility, emphasizing human imagination over ecological reality. And in doing so, creates a story that can drift like a feather through time. Across sunlit rural yards and sleepy villages, another gentle assumption arose. That roosters only crow at sunrise. Picture. Softly. A farm at dawn, mist curling along fences, chickens stirring, and a rooster perched carefully atop a weathered post, chest puffed, beak opening to release a call. Observers, noting the dramatic signal of morning, generalized the behavior across all hours. In truth, roosters crow throughout the day, marking territory, responding to disturbances, and communicating with the flock. Imagine gently. The rooster lifting its head mid-morning as a shadow moves across the yard, tail feathers flicking, call rolling slowly across grass and barn boards, entirely ordinary, entirely vigilant. Yet never restricted to the first rays of sun. The myth, soft and persistent, arises from human attention to ritual and pattern, noticing sunrise as symbolic and projecting regularity onto a naturally irregular rhythm. Observing quietly, one appreciates, softly, the subtle timing, social cues, and environmental factors guiding vocalizations. The story persists because it fits neatly into schedules, symbolisms, and human expectation. Not because the bird itself follows such rigid temporal rules. There was also the quietly exaggerated idea that sharks can smell a drop of blood from miles away. Imagine softly. A slow, rolling ocean, currents shifting gently beneath a dimly filtered sun, the water cool and vast, a shadow moving beneath the surface. Sharks are indeed highly sensitive to blood, able to detect minute concentrations in water, but the distance depends heavily on currents, salinity, and flow. A solitary drop does not immediately reach miles without dilution. Imagine the shark gliding with long, fluid movements, nostrils sampling currents, mouth closed, muscles rippling, entirely ordinary, and yet exquisitely tuned to its environment. The myth exaggerates sensitivity to create a sense of predatory omniscience. In reality, sharks navigate complex chemical and mechanical cues, hunting with precision over short distances, interpreting the subtle language of the sea. The story drifts softly through observation, imagination, and literature, embellishing natural prowess into supernatural acuity. Entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely human. And there lingered, softly, the curious belief that you can hypnotize a chicken by drawing a line. Imagine gently. A barnyard in late afternoon, hay soft underfoot, a chicken pecking idly, feathers catching stray light. Observers discovered that if a chicken's head is held gently and a line is drawn on the ground before it, the bird may freeze briefly, an immobile pause in rhythm with its surroundings. Yet, this is not true hypnosis, not the surrender of consciousness to suggestion, but a natural response. A brief stillness often associated with startle reflex, attention, or mild stress. Imagine softly. The chicken blinking slowly, tail feathers twitching subtly, eventually resuming pecking with calm deliberation. The myth drifts quietly, charmingly, across folk wisdom, magic demonstrations, and curious experiments, exaggerating ordinary, momentary behavior into a dramatic spectacle. It reminds us, softly, that observation often mixes with imagination, and stillness can be misinterpreted as enchantment. The story lingers like mist over morning grass, inviting contemplation, curiosity, and gentle amusement. Entirely ordinary, entirely harmless, entirely perfect for a slow, dreamy reflection. In the quiet, misty canopies of mid-20th century imagination, a belief drifted softly that sloths are lazy by choice. Picture. slowly. A rainforest alive with dripping leaves, shafts of sunlight sifting through moss-covered branches, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. There, a sloth moves with deliberate slowness, limbs curling and uncurling, claws gripping the bark with patient precision. Observers assumed the animal's languid pace reflected indolence, a quiet refusal to act with vigor. Yet, the truth, drifting gently into observation, is that this slowness is an exquisite adaptation, a conservation of energy suited to a diet of low-calorie leaves. Imagine softly the slow rumble of digestion, the minimal caloric expenditure, the rhythmic breathing of a creature that moves only as necessary. Entirely ordinary, entirely careful, entirely efficient. Its slow progress is survival, not whim, a delicate negotiation with the forest's abundant yet energy-poor foliage. The myth, floating through classrooms, casual observations, and storytelling, exaggerates choice over biology, turning necessity into narrative. Observe gently the stillness between movements, the soft sway in the canopy, the quiet patience of a being entirely attuned to rhythm and metabolic needs. The story persists, not in cruelty or neglect, but as a gentle human projection onto a marvel of evolution, drifting like a feather through the consciousness, inviting reflection on quiet persistence rather than imagined laziness. There is also a soft, persistent notion that dolphins always rescue humans. Imagine the gentle lapping of warm ocean waters, sunlight scattering like tiny motes across soft waves, a dolphin's sleek back cutting smoothly through the surface. People have indeed witnessed instances of dolphins guiding swimmers, protecting them from sharks, or nudging lost humans toward boats. Yet, not every encounter is beneficial. Dolphins are wild, intelligent animals whose behavior reflects curiosity, social interaction, and environmental cues. Imagine softly a pod gliding beneath the surface, clicking and whistling in low, musical pulses, observing, communicating, navigating. Entirely ordinary, entirely attuned to each other rather than to human expectation. The myth embellishes the benevolence into constant heroism, softening the edges of unpredictability into a narrative of near-constant rescue. In truth, interactions are occasional, remarkable, but not universal, not guaranteed, not reflective of intent toward humans. The story drifts gently through popular culture, newspapers, and folklore, capturing imagination without scientific precision. A soft layering of wonder atop ordinary marine intelligence. In the mid-20th century, a quietly persistent tale suggested that birds will explode if they eat rice. Picture, softly, a sunlit courtyard, petals drifting in the air, small birds hopping across cobblestones, pecking delicately at scattered grains. Observers imagine dramatic consequences, extrapolating digestive danger from human notions of swelling and expansion. Yet, the truth is far more mundane, entirely ordinary. Birds' digestive systems accommodate grains, including uncooked rice, without harm. Imagine softly a sparrow nibbling, digestive processes unfolding with quiet precision, enzymes breaking down starches gently, the bird hopping onward. Entirely unharmed, entirely natural. The myth, persistent, dramatic, yet harmless, illustrates human tendency to magnify consequences for narrative appeal. Rice may swell with water, but the bird's crop and digestive tract manage it calmly, rhythmically, efficiently. The story drifts through folklore, wedding advice, and casual warnings, embellishing ordinary biology with imagined catastrophe, softly persistent like moss growing in quiet patches on stone. Another quietly enduring story suggested that penguins are monogamous across their lifetimes. Imagine softly an Antarctic shore, ice shelves glinting pale blue, a penguin couple standing close, feathers ruffling in the gentle, frigid wind. Observers, noting courtship rituals, extrapolated lifelong pair bonds to all species. In reality, many penguin species may change partners seasonally, influenced by survival pressures, mate availability, and environmental conditions. Imagine softly. The careful inspection of bills, the shuffling across icy terrain, the calling and responding. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive behavior. The myth persists because humans anthropomorphize devotion, projecting the romantic ideal onto the natural world. Yet, each season brings practical decisions, and pairings may shift with circumstance, survival, and reproductive success. The story drifts gently, softening biology into narrative, offering poetic symmetry where nature prefers flexibility and quiet, meticulous balance. A quietly persistent belief also whispered that wolves are dangerous man-eaters. Picture. Softly. A shadowed forest, thin sunlight filtering through birch trunks, the faint rustle of undergrowth as a pack moves through misty glades. Early observers, hearing stories or witnessing rare predatory events, generalized to human danger. Yet, wild wolves rarely attack humans. Their behavior reflects social structure, prey availability, and instinctive caution. Imagine softly. A wolf pausing, nostrils twitching, ears flicking, assessing movement in its environment, retreating when uncertain. Entirely ordinary, entirely cautious, entirely self-preserving. The myth exaggerates risk, softening the quiet, organized life of the pack into a narrative of threat. It persists, whispered across folklore, children's tales, and storytelling, emphasizing caution while embellishing danger. Observed closely, wolves are intelligent, socially complex, and typically shy of humans, their quiet existence flowing through forests and tundra with careful, methodical grace. Entirely natural, entirely ordinary, entirely remarkable in its unhurried precision. In the humid warmth of mid-20th century imagination, a quietly persistent notion floated. That mosquitoes prefer sweet blood. Picture. Softly. A twilight garden, shadows stretching across tall grasses, the air thick with gentle fragrances of blossoms and moist earth. A tiny mosquito hovers near a leaf, wings buzzing with delicate rhythm, body sensing imperceptible cues in the air. Observers, noting that some people seemed to attract more bites, assumed sweetness of the blood was the key. Yet, if we drift slowly into understanding, the truth is subtler, more ordinary, entirely biological. Mosquitoes are attracted to carbon dioxide exhaled from lungs, warmth radiating from the skin, and chemical compounds naturally emitted through sweat and skin oils. Imagine softly. A mosquito tracing invisible currents of CO2, adjusting flight with gentle precision, antennae flicking as it navigates a delicate landscape of sensory cues. Entirely ordinary, entirely instinctual. The myth embellishes preference into taste, transforming complex environmental and chemical interactions into a simplistic, human-flavored narrative. In reality, the tiny insect operates with astonishing sensitivity, guided not by sweetness alone, but by a sophisticated combination of signals evolved over millennia. The story drifts through gardens, laboratories, and casual observation, gently persisting as a notion that humans can categorize or taste the invisible preferences of a creature entirely different from themselves. It is a quiet misinterpretation, lingering like morning mist over leaves. A soft, persistent whisper of fascination projected onto natural behavior. During the same era, another gentle belief suggested that cranes mate for life. Picture. Softly. A marshy expanse, reeds swaying, water reflecting pale sunlight, the distant silhouette of a crane standing still, neck curved with careful elegance. Observers, enchanted by courtship rituals and repeated pairings, extrapolated lifelong devotion to all species. Yet, many crane species form seasonal bonds, pairing for a breeding cycle rather than across lifetimes. Imagine softly. A crane dancing delicately upon mud and shallow water, wings flaring, call rippling across the still surface, partner nearby. Behavior entirely dictated by reproductive timing, environmental cues, and survival strategy. The myth embellishes continuity into romantic permanence, softening natural, practical life into poetic devotion. Observation reveals that partnerships shift as necessity and opportunity change, the rhythm of life unfolding quietly, meticulously, entirely ordinary. The story drifts gently, floating between ornithological study and human expectation, softening biology into narrative, inviting admiration for intricate social behavior while slightly overshooting temporal fidelity. It is a quiet, enduring charm of human imagination. There was also a quietly dramatic tale. That crocodiles cannot run fast on land. Picture. Softly. The edge of a sun-dappled river, ripples moving lazily across mud banks, a crocodile's scaled back breaking the gentle surface. Observers, noting the typically slow, deliberate crawl, assumed absolute sluggishness. Yet, crocodiles can sprint in short bursts of surprising speed, up to roughly 11 miles per hour on land, though only for limited distances. Imagine gently. The reptile lunging forward briefly, claws scratching mud, tail coiling slightly to balance. Entirely ordinary, entirely functional, entirely brief in display. The myth softens reality, exaggerating slow habitual movement into universal incapacity. Short bursts allow escape or sudden ambush, energy conserved for swimming and hunting. This quiet exaggeration drifts through folk wisdom and zoological assumption alike, a gentle reminder that apparent sluggishness masks latent capability. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely precise in purpose. Late in the century, a myth arose. That jellyfish are immortal. Picture. Softly. A dimly lit oceanic expanse, currents drifting like silk ribbons, tiny organisms swirling, translucent forms gliding gently with the flow. Some species, like Turritopsis dohrnii, can revert from adult to earlier stages, a remarkable process called transdifferentiation, allowing a form of biological resetting. Yet, most jellyfish die naturally, falling prey to predators, environmental conditions, or senescence. Imagine softly. A jellyfish drifting, tentacles trailing like delicate threads, life cycles turning quietly, beautifully, entirely ordinary. The myth exaggerates potential into certainty, transforming rare regenerative capacity into a poetic claim of immortality. Observation reveals subtlety, fragility, and exquisite adaptation. Entirely ordinary, entirely fascinating without needing dramatization. The story drifts gently through media and casual conversation, a soft, persistent exaggeration of a natural marvel. There was also a quietly enduring belief that polar bears cover their noses to hide. Picture. Softly. An Arctic expanse, snow drifting like powdered glass, the pale light stretching across ice floes, a polar bear standing alert. Observers extrapolated from behaviors in trained animals or staged photographs, imagining stealth tactics involving manual concealment of the nose. In reality, wild polar bears do not perform this act. Their hunting strategy relies on silent stalking, patience, and camouflage with fur blending into snow. Imagine softly. A bear pressing its body low, breathing carefully, eyes focused, nose unobstructed. Entirely ordinary, entirely effective in its natural environment. The myth persists through folklore, exaggerated tales, and anthropomorphic interpretation, drifting like soft snow across imagination, emphasizing cleverness over the quiet, patient rhythm of real predatory behavior. It is a gentle story of misinterpretation layered upon remarkable adaptation, entirely harmless, entirely ordinary, entirely compelling in subtlety. In the cool, shadowed depths of oceanic imagination, a quietly circulating tale whispered that lobsters do not age. Picture. Softly. A rocky seafloor, algae drifting like moss, currents shifting slowly over barnacle-encrusted stones, a lobster crawling cautiously with delicate, measured movements. Observers noted longevity and slow growth, imagining timelessness. Yet, The gentle truth is less magical and more ordinary. Lobsters grow slowly, molting their shells periodically throughout life, a process that allows continued growth and cellular regeneration, but mortality is inevitable, influenced by disease, predation, and environmental pressures. Imagine softly. A lobster's antennae waving through water, tiny sensory hairs detecting currents, its legs moving with precise coordination. Entirely ordinary, entirely adapted, entirely subject to the rhythms of life. The myth elevates longevity into immortality, drifting through scientific curiosity and public imagination alike, softening ordinary biology into legend. Each molt, each subtle aging change, quiet and almost imperceptible, reminds us that survival is a measured, patient process. The story lingers, gentle as drifting kelp, a slow and persistent whisper of human wonder applied to a small, ordinary creature navigating the complex, shadowed seafloor, entirely natural, entirely mortal, entirely remarkable in the subtlety of slow life. A quietly persistent belief suggested that dogs wag their tails only when happy. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled yard, autumn leaves tumbling lazily to the ground, a dog standing alert, tail sweeping gently back and forth. Observers noticed the rhythmic movement and assumed it reflected joy. Yet, tail wagging is more nuanced. Dogs communicate stress, alertness, nervousness, and occasionally aggression through tail position, speed, and motion. Imagine softly. The delicate shift of tail feathers, the subtle curl of muscles beneath fur, ears flicking, nostrils flaring. Entirely ordinary, entirely communicative, entirely part of the dog's social and emotional toolkit. The myth simplifies rich behavioral signaling into a single, charming narrative, drifting gently through popular culture, cartoons, and casual stories. Each wag, each pause, each flick, is a subtle message decoded in context, a quiet language of motion. Humans interpret, embellish, and anthropomorphize. Soft projections layered onto ordinary communication, entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary. In the gentle warmth of late 20th century imagination, koalas were thought always to be friendly. Picture. Softly. Eucalyptus trees rising like quiet towers, leaves trembling in a breeze, a koala nestled in a fork, limbs wrapped delicately around bark. Observers, enchanted by round eyes and fuzzy ears, assumed amiable temperament. Yet, koalas can be aggressive, territorial, and protective of their space. Males may engage in growls, lunges, and sharp claws when threatened, defending their home ranges. Imagine softly. A koala pressing low against a branch, eyes blinking slowly, jaw moving with cautious intention. Entirely ordinary, entirely defensive, entirely adapted. The myth softens sharp claws and territorial instincts into cuddliness, drifting through children's books, media, and human affection for the cute image. Each huff, each gentle push, each defensive posture, quietly communicates boundaries. Humans often read friendliness where biology has simple survival and social rules. The story lingers, a soft, enduring projection of desire for calm, unthreatening wildlife, entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely appropriate for the rhythm of eucalyptus forests. There was also a quietly persistent notion that great white sharks must eat every day. Picture. Softly. An endless, pale ocean, shafts of light dancing slowly on undulating waves, a sleek shark gliding with rhythmic motion beneath the surface. Observers imagined constant predation, relentless hunger. Yet, great whites can go weeks without feeding, their metabolism and energy-efficient swimming allowing long intervals between meals. Imagine softly. The shark's fins slicing through water, gills moving steadily, eyes focused. Entirely ordinary, entirely patient, entirely adapted. Occasional hunting bursts punctuate long, calm cruising, subtle shifts of energy dictating strategy. The myth exaggerates predatory immediacy, softening patient, evolved behavior into a narrative of insatiable appetite. It drifts through popular media, films, and sensational storytelling, quietly embellishing survival into urgency. Each glide, each slow turn, each barely perceptible adjustment. A whisper of precision, entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely remarkable in its silent effectiveness. In the drifting, twilight world of imagination, owls were thought to embody wisdom. Picture. Softly. A quiet grove, mist curling over moss-covered stones, the silent sweep of wings, amber eyes reflecting faint light. Observers, noting the large eyes, solemn posture, and nocturnal habits, projected human intelligence onto their quiet presence. Yet, owl intelligence varies. Many species demonstrate cognitive abilities similar to other birds, and not all are extraordinary problem solvers. Imagine softly. An owl perched on a gnarled branch, head slowly pivoting, observing, listening, entirely ordinary, entirely focused on prey detection and survival. Entirely natural. The myth elevates appearance and nocturnal calm into symbolic wisdom, drifting through literature, folklore, and art, softening ordinary survival behavior into contemplative human projection. Each tilt of the head, each quiet turn of feathers, each silent glide, whispers precision, adaptation, and attentiveness, entirely ordinary, entirely ordinary, entirely ordinary. Yet endlessly fascinating when watched in the still, quiet hours of forest twilight. A quietly persistent tale drifted through late 20th century imagination. That cats always land on their feet unharmed. Picture. Softly. A sun-dappled room, dust motes floating lazily, a cat crouched on a low windowsill, tail flicking, ears pivoting to distant sounds. Observers noticed the grace and agility of felines twisting midair, imagining invulnerability. Yet, the gentle truth is less fantastical. While cats have a righting reflex, enabling them to orient mid-fall, injury or death can still occur, especially from great heights or hazardous surfaces. Imagine softly. The subtle flex of muscles, the careful positioning of limbs, the delicate spread of paws. Entirely ordinary, entirely precise, entirely alive. Their skeletal flexibility, light frame, and unusually low terminal velocity allow many cats to land successfully, but surfaces, fatigue, age, and underlying health can alter the outcome. The myth elevates agility into perfection, drifting through stories, films, and casual observation, softening reality into myth. Each leap, each twist, each delicate landing. A whisper of evolution at work, a quiet harmony of anatomy and instinct. Humans admire, exaggerate, and anthropomorphize, projecting certainty onto chance and skill. Entirely harmless, entirely persistent, entirely ordinary, entirely feline, quietly reminding us of the delicate interplay between nature and imagination. In another gently circulating notion, snakes were said to chase humans. Picture. Softly. A sun-warmed forest floor, leaves rustling in a slow breeze, a snake coiling beneath a branch. Observers interpreted sudden movements toward people as pursuit. Yet, most snakes flee unless cornered or threatened, using speed and stealth to escape predators rather than initiate attacks. Imagine softly. A tongue flicking, nostrils sampling the air, muscles tensing, the body ready to retreat. Entirely ordinary, entirely cautious, entirely natural. The myth exaggerates threat, drifting through folklore and cautionary tales, softening defensive behavior into pursuit. Some snakes may appear to follow humans because they are adjusting movement in the same corridor or investigating vibrations, not plotting aggression. Each silent glide, each measured movement, each careful pause. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely precise. Quietly misunderstood, demonstrating that fear and survival instincts, while subtle, are always at work beneath scales glinting in dappled light. In a quietly imagined world, gorillas were thought to be violent by nature. Picture. Softly. A misty rainforest, ferns brushing the ground, a silverback moving carefully among his group. Observers noted size and strength, assuming aggression. Yet, wild gorillas are generally peaceful, shy, and social, resolving conflicts with subtle posturing and gentle communication. Imagine softly. Chests puffing slowly, hands brushing leaves, eyes observing. Entirely ordinary, entirely patient, entirely socially attuned. Family cohesion, grooming rituals, low vocalizations, and slow movement structure gorilla life, ensuring harmony without unnecessary confrontation. The myth exaggerates strength into aggression, drifting through media, films, and human projection. Each cautious step, each measured gesture, each low grunt. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely gentle. A dance of social intelligence often unnoticed but quietly persistent in the rhythm of the forest. Another softly persistent idea suggested that raccoons wash food before eating. Picture. Softly. A stream glinting through twilight, leaves floating lazily, a raccoon dipping a small morsel of food. Observers interpreted the motion as cleansing. Yet, raccoons manipulate food and water to assess texture and ease of consumption, not for hygiene. Imagine softly. Little hands turning, probing, squeezing, paws dripping. Entirely ordinary, entirely tactile, entirely attentive. Their highly sensitive paws and curiosity-driven intelligence allow them to explore environmental stimuli, testing objects and assessing edibility. The myth embellishes habit into intent, drifting through stories and cartoons, softening exploratory behavior into ritualized cleanliness. Each careful probe, each subtle rotation, each tiny movement. Entirely ordinary, entirely adaptive, entirely subtle. A quiet reminder of the rich, sensory engagement present in small, nocturnal lives. A quietly observed phenomenon suggested that deer freeze in headlights from fear. Picture. Softly. A misty country road, glimmering asphalt, trees standing like slow sentinels. Observers interpreted motionless stares at lights as fear-induced paralysis. Yet, deer are dazzled by sudden glare, their vision disrupted, and confusion, rather than terror, halts movement. Imagine softly. Ears pivoting, eyes reflecting light, muscles tense but ready. Entirely ordinary, entirely reactive, entirely adaptive. Their eyes, adapted for low-light vision, can struggle with sudden artificial illumination, creating the illusion of immobility. The myth transforms visual confusion into fear, drifting through human imagination and storytelling. Each pause, each hesitation, each blink. A subtle negotiation with sensory input. Entirely ordinary, entirely natural, entirely gentle. And a quiet reminder of how perception shapes behavior in soft, shadowed landscapes. And so, with all these myths, we find that the truth is slower, smaller, and somehow softer than the stories first told. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.